Hi everyone, and welcome to The Climate of Sport with me, Claire Poole, the podcast where we explore how the world of sport can drive climate action, champion equality and shape a more sustainable future. From the boardroom to the locker room, from grassroots to global stages, the game is changing and so are we. Let's get into it. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Climate of Sport podcast with me, Claire Poole. It's great to be back with you again this week, and what a week it's been. In the opening of the Glasgow 2026 Commonwealth Games, Gianni Infantino's 15-slide rant on Instagram, FIFA's new plan to get more money. We've also, which we're going to get into actually in our climate hat trick shortly. Also, other notable things this week, world number 19, Ekaterina Alexandrova, collapsed on court and had to retire from her first round match of the Memphis Classic due to extreme heat. Temperatures were around 34 Celsius, 93 degrees Fahrenheit. So she did manage to stand and get off court, but she had to retire early due to the extreme heat. And we noted in the weeks since I spoke to you last, the Tour de France finished, and we were just reflecting on the impact of the wildfires across the Tour this year. So just as sort of a roundup of that, the wildfires that are still blazing across Europe and the extreme heat as well. They did impact various stages of the Tour de France, and I think for sure the biggest impact on the Tour in recent years, in terms of at least 3 stages being impacted by the wildfires and extreme heat. So stage 3, fans were told to stay away, and the caravan didn't pass through the race route because of the wildfires nearby. So a health and safety measure there. Then stage 9, 30 kilometres were cut out of that stage due to the extreme heat. And then notably, the final stage was reduced by 44 kilometres, not necessarily because of the direct impact of the wildfires on that particular stage, but the fact that security services were deployed elsewhere to tackle wildfires. So the last one's a really important reminder that across other stages where there were direct impacts, the Tour was actually impacted indirectly as well, because of course sport doesn't take place in a vacuum, especially where it's working in communities with municipal services that are needed elsewhere. So everything's interconnected. It's been a really impactful year for sport because of the climate crisis. We are seeing a lot of impacts this summer in the Northern Hemisphere. Also this week, our finalists for the Sport Positive Awards were announced, and congratulations to everyone who was shortlisted, and thank you to everyone who entered as well the awards this year. There are over 80 people who are referenced as individuals, organizations, programs, papers, so much good stuff that we are able to surface through Sport Positive Awards, and a lot of emails and insights from the people who have been shortlisted, and many saying it's already raising awareness of their work in areas that it hadn't been previously, just from the shortlist announcement. So we love to hear that. That's exactly why we do it, to amplify the great work that's happening and push momentum. So brilliant to hear on that. We're going to put the link in the show notes to the shortlist if you haven't checked it out. I'm sure there will be people and organizations and initiatives that are new to you that you can learn from and that you can connect with in our global community. So take a look at that. Okay, our climate hat trick of the week. The first story, of course, can't be anything apart from the price of growth, what FIFA's latest plan could mean for the planet. So the World Cup's over. You thought we might stop talking about FIFA. Alas, they are very keen to not let us stop talking about them in terms of what they're announcing and what's happening. So this would be the biggest story of the week. Could end up being the biggest story of the month, the year, and possibly the decade, depending on how things go. FIFA confirmed its president Infantino wants to launch a subsidiary of FIFA worth $20 billion, or 15 to 17.5 billion euro, and sell off more than 20% of the new FIFA Forward enterprise by raising $4.2 billion from private investors. So if you haven't seen this story, the quick cliff notes are, after finishing up the World Cup cycle that netted the Footballing Association $10 billion, we think, this news has come out that Infantino plans to form a commercial subsidiary, which would be called FIFA Forward Enterprise, FFE, running competitions like the World Cup and the Club World Cup. So the intention is that investors can have a stake in this subsidiary then obviously there would be more investment coming in. So bearing in mind the last World Cup cycle, men's World Cup cycle, netted them $10 billion. It's not enough. There needs to be more money. So what's interesting about this is some of the intended investors include Thrive Eternal, which was launched by Joshua Kushner, whose brother Jared Kushner is the son-in-law of US President Donald Trump. There are dots being connected here. There's a lot of information out there. Joshua Kushner is famously a Democrat and says he didn't vote for Trump in 2016. There's some information around that in the public domain. But obviously, because of the US, Canada, and Mexico World Cup, and obviously the relationship between Gianni Infantino and President Trump, and some of the decisions were made across that, the timing, the alignment, the connections, there is a lot of media coverage around the dots here. UEFA have already strenuously pushed back. They immediately put out a response on Instagram, and it's been reported by media outlets that they're having an emergency meeting this week. So they said in that Instagram post, the soul and governance of football are not assets to trade, especially with zero transparency as to who gains financially. None of us are the owners of football. It's not FIFA's to sell. So there's no end of insight and media coverage around the governance, the ethical and the economic impacts of this idea. But of course, what we want to look at are the potential climate implications of this move. So the main one really that we can draw a line with is if this were to take place, hopefully it won't, but if it does, there will of course become more pressure for revenue growth. And this is probably the biggest climate risk. So we've already spent a lot of time talking about the fact in various different guises that there needs to be a reckoning at some point with growth, not just within sport, but within everything, in terms of that being the cornerstone and that being what everyone is seeking in terms of success, growth, because fundamentally it's unsustainable and we are overusing the planet's resources and we are having too much of an impact for it to be sustainable. We've already had 3 record-breaking heat years on the bounce. We're already pushing forward in terms of going beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius of post-industrial levels of heat, and ending growth is unsustainable. And we need to start reckoning with that across every industry, but of course we're interested in sport. We have to start thinking more strategically and more innovatively about the future, and we'll cover that in another story in our climate hat trick as well. But come on, private investors like this are going to expect return, even if they don't control FIFA. Their only objective will be growth of the commercial business. So that doesn't take a genius to work out. And that then is likely to encourage higher dependence on sponsors. With that, already a lot of pushback of FIFA's existing sponsors in terms of their high carbon nature and protests across the World Cup about Aramco and Hyundai, Coca-Cola and others. So that higher dependence on sponsors and then who those sponsors are and what ramifications that has. The creation probably of new tournaments, as well as the expansion of existing ones that's already been mooted, increasing number of matches as those new tournaments or expanded tournaments grow, which then leads to more host cities, probably longer tournaments, and all of that will increase international flight, domestic travel, hotel demand, stadium operations, broadcasting infrastructure, and so on. We always talk about fan travel. That's going to be the largest source of emissions for mega sporting events. So a stronger focus on commercial growth and more, this concept of just more, bigger, more money, more growth, bigger, bigger, bigger. That is going to make it even more difficult than ever to reduce the environmental impact of sporting events like the World Cup or the Club World Cup. So these effects, of course, are not just about carbon either. This aggressively growth-oriented model would also increase water use. It would increase potentially land use in terms of conversion for stadium infrastructures that are needed to service this expansion. Waste generation, of course, biodiversity loss, depending on new developments and where they go, and pressure on local transport systems as well, if upgrades aren't made. So FIFA's already faced a lot of criticism over the climate impact of the ideas of tournament expansion in recent years, given it has got climate emission targets and for reduction. So how does this fit with their existing targets of reducing their impact in the environment? That is something we need to get into further. So again, let's just make this connection quickly with Thrive Capital and Thrive Eternal, these organizations launched by Joshua Kushner, and that connection. So I had a little nose around them as well. Both organizations are very sparse websites. The Thrive Capital simply says Thrive Capital builds and invests in internet software and technology-abled companies, and Thrive Eternal was only created as an organization in April 2026. At the moment, again, just a one-page website, but it says our first partnership is expected to be with the San Francisco Giants. That is referenced. Seemingly, if they're going to put that on the website as basically the only one page of information, that must be fairly certain in terms of that happening at some point soon. It also says in that text on the homepage, they see investment opportunity in iconic franchises and cultural institutions rooted in tradition, identity, and shared experience. In a world shaped by abundant intelligence, where creation scales and distribution fragment, we believe they will matter even more. The reference to the San Francisco Giants and now their involvement with this new FIFA potential enterprise means they're obviously talking about football and sport, American football and football or soccer more broadly. I think that's really interesting. Joshua Kushner made his money by early backing of Instagram and OpenAI, which is obviously the shaping of the world of abundant intelligence and where creation scales and distribution fragments, and the fact that sport's going to matter even more. They're saying our sector is going to be more and more important in that way. So as well as causing the growth that's making the fragmentation, they are now looking to get involved in what's going to hold our global communities together through the likes of sport. I thought that was interesting. So why do I mention this? I guess part of me looking into that was hoping, a tiny fragment of me that still has hope that maybe they are organizations that invest in climate technology, or they have a really strong ESG portfolio. And we could think, well, even at least if this does happen, maybe there'll be some investor accountability around these decision making, but it appears not. They seem to be very much focused on assets that are going to grow and give them return, which is, of course, what investors do. So that's the reason I mentioned that. From an environmental governance perspective, I think the most worrying element would be the shift in FIFA's institutional logic. Obviously, historically, FIFA's mandate has been, at least formally, to govern world football. Commercial revenues are supposed to support that mission. And a reminder that FIFA is a non-profit organization. So all of this money should be going into the development of world football. If the commercial arm becomes an investable asset with outside shareholders, there is, of course, a concern that that relationship would reverse. Instead, the governance of football would increasingly serve the growth of a commercial asset. And that would be a fundamental shift in sporting governance that could have ripple effects. So we're going to talk about unintended consequences in the next couple of climate hat-trick stories, but that could create a ripple effect that would have unending impacts on sport governance and set a precedent around that. Hopefully this is not going to happen. UEFA have already pushed back. But again, FIFA have announced the money from this deal would go to their 211 member associations. Of those 211, 55 are in Europe. UEFA has 55 member associations, so just under a quarter of the FIFA membership. But importantly, those 55 member organizations house some of the world's most successful teams. So I think out of the 8 teams that ended up past the semi-finals of the FIFA Men's World Cup 2026 were from UEFA member states. So UEFA has only just under a quarter of members, but they do have a massive amount of power when it comes to who those members are and who they represent. And there's also been reports that football associations were not given any prior warning of this announcement from FIFA ahead of it happening. So that is an important bit of context as well. So what's going to come out of that meeting this week will be very telling. We'll probably be able to chat about that more next week, hopefully. So what's the outlook for climate action around this idea? So FIFA is presenting this as an investment in world football, following commercial revenues to fund their perceived immediate priority, seemingly without paying any attention again to the biggest long-term threat to the game itself in terms of the climate crisis. So every major scientific assessment now says we need to urgently reduce emissions, adapt to a hotter world, and rethink systems built on perpetual growth. So the irony here is that the greatest investment FIFA could actually make in the future of the game is ensuring that football can still be played safely and sustainably in 20, 30, 50 years' time. If commercial growth becomes the overriding objective, there's no way that the game's long-term resilience is going to be prioritized over short-term returns. And I think that is the biggest impact on this model. And my last point on this is the numbers that have been bandied around in terms of getting those funding into football associations in terms of football development, 20 million from the years 2027 to 2030 for FIFA member associations. They're currently earmarked to get 8 million. That would go up to 20 million, they're saying, from this deal. That is not going to go anywhere near the climate adaptation that's going to be needed to actually play football safely and sustainably long into the future. So again, the short-term gains are being prioritized over the long-term resilience. And this could have massive manifold impacts for not just football, but sport, for climate action in sport, and for the governance of sport as well. So we'll wait and see what comes out of that. But hopefully that's a helpful insight in terms of how FIFA's latest plan, in terms of the price of growth, what that's going to mean for the climate. So that's our first story. Our second story is about Glasgow showing that the future of mega sport events might be less mega. So a different angle to this as well. I mentioned there in our first story about every action having unintended consequences and what that might be. And that, I think, is the case with the 2026 Commonwealth Games. When Victoria pulled out in 2023 because of rising costs, there was a bit of a moment of like, what's going to happen here? Is this the end of the Commonwealth Games 3 years before the Games were due to happen? Is this going to be the end? Is we going to have to miss a round? What are we going to do? Glasgow stepped in to host. And when they did that, there were some stipulations, obviously, with the very small runway to the event actually happening. But they probably didn't think fully, potentially they did, I don't know. But I would guess that they hadn't really extrapolated fully that this decision might change the face of the Games forever. By the time Victoria pulled out and Glasgow moved in, it was just over 2 years till the Games, which opened last week, to pull everything together. So a scaled-back Games was the only option, a lower budget, and obviously only using existing venues because of the amount of time that was available. The Game CEO, Phil Batty, was interviewed recently and said he believes the compact schedule and the fact they didn't use any public funding could provide a blueprint for the next 100 years when it comes to the Commonwealth Games. As we mentioned, against a horizon of unending growth, seemingly, within sport and elsewhere, this thought definitely plays for the planet when we think about not just the planet, but also trying to think about things differently. And importantly, when it comes to bidding for these events, which is always a bone of contention, the amount of public funding and the economic returns that come from them. So that's really interesting. And then the Games, the Reimagined Games, focuses on treading lighter on the planet, how they call it, by reducing waste and reducing their carbon emissions as well. Sustainability is a key thread across all the Games. King Charles III spoke at the opening ceremony, and he highlighted the sustainability thread as well as combating plastic pollution. And we saw a different story about that as well. Some people who are visiting the Games in Glasgow, when they grab a coffee or a cocktail, they have a phrase called "all in" for the Games, and then a lot of waste plastic from other sectors have been made into these, like a little stencil almost, that you put on top of a coffee or on top of a cocktail to dust over with a bit of cocoa or something, and then have the phrase "all in" on top of it. So if you're in Glasgow and you're around the city, if you see that, that's a connection to reducing plastic pollution as well. So some material campaigns happening there. King Charles said in his speech, addressing plastic pollution complements the immense global efforts required to protect 30% of the world's ocean by 2030. Caring for the ocean's natural capital ensures our communities and businesses continue to thrive and vital global food resources can be enhanced. In spite of the fact that in the UK, some areas have now gone over 30 days plus without rain, which is unheard of, and breaking records for the most amount of days over 30 degrees Celsius this year, the climate crisis is alive and well, with Glasgow experiencing unprecedented levels of rain at some of their competitions this week. So the BBC reported persistent rain turned torrential, and the first two throws of the women's hammer slipped from the athlete's grip and clattered into the cage as thunder cracked above the arena. In the same article, they spoke about Northern Ireland's Kate O'Hara, saying she was gutted with her throw in the heptathlon shot put because the shot put kept slipping out of her hands. She said when the chalk gets wet, it's like you may as well have dish soap on your hands, and I probably spent too much time and effort trying to stay dry rather than doing the cues I was working on in training. So again, another reminder of how extreme weather, unexpected weather happening can impact athletes' process and how it can impact the results and their performance as well. Other bits that are happening around the game, which I think are noteworthy as well, Sport England and BASES supported Team England athletes to use their voice to raise awareness at the games and beyond with a little pack of information about how they could do that, which is great. We love to see those assets, and we'll put a link in the show notes to those as well if you want to take a look. Can we talk about the Glasgow 2026 Commonwealth Games without mentioning the fact a large Tunnocks tea cake, which for those who are uninitiated are a delicious, not vegan unfortunately, chocolate marshmallow biscuit confection that are very synonymous with the region. And prior to me being vegan, I would enjoy a Tunnocks tea cake with a cup of tea and very much enjoyed that. So that coming down from the ceiling, an absolutely massive giant Tunnocks tea cake coming down from the ceiling with sparks flying out of it, has to be one of the most iconic images from the opening ceremony as well. So props to the creative team who were involved with that. Our last time at Hat Trick Story, I've called First Come First Served, who owns the sporting calendar in a warming world. I'm sorry, we're back to FIFA again, but it came up because there's a question I'm asked on panels a lot. So when I speak at events or I'm interviewed, a question that inevitably comes up is, does the existing sporting calendar need to be rethought due to the impacts of the climate crisis? Because obviously, as we've spoken about there already on this podcast, we've spoken about impacts on the Tour de France. We've spoken about impacts at the Glasgow Commonwealth Games. We've spoken about impacts at the Memphis Open. Sporting events are being impacted more and more by extreme weather, extreme heat, and climate crisis impact. So obviously, there's this question of, do we need to move the sporting calendar around to target times of the year where this is less likely to happen? So the winner of the Tour de France, Pogacar, said, if it was up to me, we wouldn't race in July and August when it's too hot. So I did write in our weekly newsletter, The Brief, this week, sorry, mate, that's getting more and more difficult to do, to find those areas in the Northern Hemisphere in July and August where you don't have extreme heat. So when I'm asked about this, I often mention Seb Coe, which I think is probably the most prominent example of someone who leads a governing body, saying quite openly the climate crisis is likely to impact and change the athletics competition calendar. He's spoken before, especially about the long distance marathon events potentially being separated from competitions in order to target different times of year or different locations that make them easier to execute. So up to now, I really feel as though we've spoken about this idea and the decision making around it as the difficult part. You know, oh gosh, what if we move this? What are the ramifications of that? What does that mean? How could that work? But we've got an example now of unintended consequences again to consider. So in the same way, back to FIFA, the FIFA Men's World Cup 2034 is due to be staged in Saudi Arabia. In the same way that Qatar 2022 was hosted in November, December of the calendar year because of extreme heat instead of the June, July slot that we're used to for the Men's World Cup. Saudi Arabia had planned the same thing, but it's now come to light that Ramadan is projected to fall between the 12th of November and the 12th of December, which would land squarely inside the Men's World Cup competition in 2034. So that's going to be very challenging from a logistical, a physiological, and obviously a cultural sensitivity perspective. There will be athletes competing who will be fasting. There'll be very specific times that fast will be broken. That can impact not just players on the pitch, but obviously probably a very large workforce that will be helping to support the game's organisation and delivery. Travelling fans coming to celebrate the World Cup, as we've just experienced in the US, Mexico, and Canada, create a festival atmosphere. And this is quite incongruous with Ramadan, which is, of course, the holiest and most sacred month in the Islamic calendar. So lots to think about there in terms of what that's going to look like. So let's think about it. Common sense wise, there's basically three options, isn't there? You go early into 2035. So they'd already thought late 2034. So push that by a few months and go into early 2025, because obviously you're not going to want to go over Thanksgiving, Christmas, and other holidays around that people might be less inclined to travel for. They're not going to do that. So then you go into early 2035. That obviously is going to conflict with the existing football calendar, a huge number of domestic leagues, and many domestic leagues like we're seeing in Japan moving in line with a European calendar of that August to May slot. So that's going to impact a lot of domestic leagues. So then say, okay, push it earlier 2034, you have the same problem. If it was the January, February, say, slot of 2034, not only impacting the domestic leagues, you've also got the Utah Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games. So in terms of a broadcast perspective, that's obviously not going to work. Or do you keep it in the same slot? Do you acknowledge that you are hosting a mega sports event in the usual slot of June, July, in a place where it regularly hits 45 to 50 degrees Celsius or 113 to 122 degrees Fahrenheit? It doesn't seem palatable. They didn't even do it for Qatar. And we're talking 12 years later. That's what we're talking about in terms of temperature now. Let us not forget that we're talking about this in 8 years' time in terms of how the climate crisis is exacerbating and worsening. God only knows what we'll be looking at there. So that doesn't feel like an option. So what are they going to do with that? We'll have to wait and see. But it did make me think about other considerations when it comes to calendar changes, because they're usually considered due to the climate crisis impacts, extreme heat, etc., and weather conditions that are unpalatable with the sport that's taken place. However, other considerations sport organisers might want to think about when they're looking at these shifts are shortened recovery time for athletes, because especially with major sporting events that are aligned with domestic tournaments, which already in many sports an incredibly busy calendar. So we have to think about recovery time, reduced windows for qualification, depending if things are moved forward or back, the role of broadcasters. If things are shifted around, which sports are going to get priority as calendars shift and which ones might be negatively impacted? How clubs and athletes especially are consulted around this and how their inputs are considered in terms of decision making. Then you have to start thinking about school holidays. You have to think about tourism season. We've already mentioned religious holidays as well. And what stage adaptations become essentially too expensive. So if keeping it where it is isn't an option, and moving it, you can't find another slot to do it, at what stage then do you adapt, and how much is too much when it comes to both the bank balance, but also the environmental impacts as well? So there is actually heaps to consider. It's not as easy as just shifting something. And then, of course, there can be huge unintended consequences and impacts after the fact, even when decisions are made. So I think when sport organisers look ahead, they do need to look ahead. And really, they have to look ahead quickly, depending on the sport and how impacted it is, because getting in with their climate adaptation calendar shift ideas earlier is going to give them a better shot of keeping their tournament on air when it comes to broadcasters and discussions around that. So my view is, in the not too distant future, we will start to see these calendar shifts. And then I think we will see a scrabble for certain slots that work for the sport, but also work for broadcast. And then I think there will be some losers in that as well. So let's see what happens. Okay, that's the climate hat trick today. Our 3 stories were the price of growth, what FIFA's latest plan could mean for climate. The second story is Glasgow showing us that the future of mega sport events might be less mega. And the third climate hat trick story was first come, first served. Who owns the sporting calendar in a warming world? I hope you found this interesting. I would love to hear from you about any other stories you'd like us to cover. We are back next week with more of the same. I hope you have a great week. I'm sending you lots of love and positive energy and vibes for the week ahead. Take care. That is a wrap on this episode of The Climate of Sport. If this got you thinking, send it to the group chat, send it to your team or someone who cares about the future of the game. Follow, subscribe, and join us next time, because the biggest wins aren't just on the scoreboard, they're out there for the planet too. See you on the next one.